Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. The topic of this panel is stability, conversion, and obedience. And on the program, it says that the chair is Reverend William Daly. I'm not a reverend. I'm a PhD student here at Notre Dame in political theory, Raul Rodriguez. If only the seminary degrees were that easy to get. But I'm the sub, so I'll be quick. Our first speaker is Christopher Fisher from Portsmouth Abbey. Christopher Fisher is the executive director of the Portsmouth Institute for Faith and Culture, a Benedictine center for the exploration of Catholic thought and the restoration of Christian culture. The Institute is a foundation of Portsmouth Abbey and St. Louis Abbey, two American houses of the English Benedictine congregation. He is also a teacher in the humanities program at Portsmouth Abbey School, an independent Catholic boarding school in Rhode Island. His work explores the intersection of Catholicism and Western culture with a focus on the influence of St. Benedict. He lives at Portsmouth Abbey with his wife Lauren and two sons, Frederick and Felix. And he has a very provocative title for his paper, A True Benedictine Option, the 10th Century English Benedictine Reform and the Poetic Kingdom of Edgar and Peaceful. And I'll try to be pretty strict on the rules, so I'll give you
Good, thanks, I appreciate that.
Please try to make it.
Yeah, sure. Good morning. First, let me express my thanks to Carter and Margaret for putting on this great conference. This is probably the third or fourth time I've come, and it's amazing every year. And I want to also thank Rod Dreyer, my co-panelist here, for inciting so much interest in St. Benedict, right, and his influence on the West. I mean, it's really amazing in the last couple of years how much that's grown. I think it's really important that we consider St. Benedict and how really he has helped form Western culture. And I think Rod has done an amazing job bringing that out. And so my talk today, I want to focus on precisely how that happened, right? If we're considering that St. Benedict was a saint who had kind of an accidental effect on Western civilization in the sense that he didn't intend, right, from his monastery in Italy to change the trajectory of Western culture, let's look at one moment, right, where we can really see up close how that influence came into being. And I think we can do that through an analysis of the 10th century English Benedictine reform of King Edgar. So let's begin. In 1536, when King Henry VIII embarked on his program to dissolve the monasteries of England and Wales and Ireland, he faced a monumental political and ecclesial task. The monastic culture of England was profoundly powerful on the eve of the English Reformation. It's estimated that about 1 out of 50 men in England were in religious orders at the time. That's a really large number. I think you only really see those kind of figures when you're at a Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture Fall Conference. Otherwise, that's an astonishing number. Surely this was no accident. Where then must we dig to find the roots of monastic England? What did the monastic influence mean for English culture throughout its history? And I think most importantly for our conversation today, in what ways did English monasticism contribute to and benefit from political life of England? The answers will take us 6 centuries back in time, from the 16th century of King Henry VIII to the 10th century of Edgar the Peaceful. And to the extent that the flourishing of Benedictine culture and its overall influence on the West is of interest to the modern reader, which I think it is, he could really do no better than study the world of King Edgar and the English Benedictine reform. So in this paper, I'll explore how the 10th century English Benedictine reform of Edgar and his monk-bishop advisors, chief among them St. Dunstan, offers perhaps the most dramatic illustration of St. Benedict's influence on the development of the West. The reformers, by strengthening monastic observance of the rule and promoting the Benedictine ideal in society and the law, sought to unify England under a distinctly Benedictine political order, the kingdom becoming, in a sense, like a monastery, a Dominici Schola Serviti, a school of the Lord's service. To demonstrate this, I'm going to do the following. First, I'll explore the spirit of the rule and the mission of St. Benedict. I'll then consider essential developments of Anglo-Saxon history leading up to the English Benedictine reform, paying particular attention to the ideal of Christian kingship which emerges between the 5th and 9th centuries, and which I think Edgar fulfills in the 10th. I'll then turn our attention to Edgar's reign specifically, which offers really an example of an ideal Christian king who sought to cultivate the ideal Christian life in his kingdom by promoting monasticism and the political life. I'll conclude by considering how the intersection of politics and religion during the English Benedictine Reform may illuminate contemporary discussion of the Benedict Option. So before we uncover the political nature of the English Benedictine Reform, we'd benefit from understanding the mission of St. Benedict and his rule. What precisely is he up to? I think the rule can be understood in two related ways. First, as really an expert, if perhaps accidental, application of Aristotelian political philosophy, and second, to borrow from Blessed John Henry Newman, as deeply poetic. So most attendees here are probably familiar with the opening line of Aristotle's Politics, but they're worth reciting here in full with the rule in mind specifically. And Aristotle writes, "Every state is a community of some kind, and every community is established with a view to some good. For mankind always acts in order to obtain that which they think good. But if all communities aim at some good, the state or political community, which is the highest of all, and which embraces all the rest, aims at good in a greater degree than any other, and at the highest good." I think few words could better express the composition and the direction of a monastery. After all, Benedict's rule is a work of politics insofar as it's legislation more than it is spiritual instruction, or perhaps better put, it's spiritual instruction in the form of legislation. The political genius of the rule is its Aristotelianism, the effectiveness by which the community directs man towards the good. The good of this particular polis, the monastery, is union with God. For the monks, the common life was the most perfect instrument of salvation and sanctification, enabling each individual to achieve the fulfillment of all his potential. This Aristotelianism is consistent with Blessed John Henry Newman's understanding of the mission of St. Benedict as poetic. Poetry, Newman says, is a liberal art because it is done for its own sake. The ends of poetry are contained within the very nature of it. Further, as opposed to science, Newman says, which addresses the reason, poetry addresses the imagination and affections. It leads to admiration, enthusiasm, love. Monasticism thus cultivates a poetic disposition towards God and the world. Monasticism, the life of the monk, is done for no end outside of itself, and it is a life lived out of unwavering devotion, admiration to God. This poetic disposition is captured in Benedict's classification of a monastery as a Dominici Schola Serviti, or what I would venture to translate as a place of leisure in service to Christ. In the rule, the abbot, which means father, emerges as the keystone of the monastic community, holding in tandem this political, poetical order, serving as both governor and symbol of the ideal Christian life. He's in a sense the monarch of his community. The monks owe to the abbot their total obedience. The abbot, though, is not unrestrained in his power. By his vows, he must obey the rule. So even though he's the highest political authority, the abbot is not a legislator. He executes the existing law in the rule. Otherwise, he leads by a sort of heroic example. The abbot's greatest contributions to his monastery are thus highly symbolic. He embodies virtue. His charity, humility, justice, and mercy each contribute to the flourishing of the monastery. By cultivating these virtues in himself and in his monastery, the abbot bears responsibility for leading the souls in his charge to their salvation. Benedict is pretty explicit about this. He writes, quote, "The abbot must be led to understand that any lack of good in his monks will be held as his fault." It's a pretty radical and powerful responsibility put on the abbot. In turn, the monks are called to a total obedience to the abbot. So the obedience of the monks is done out of admiration, enthusiasm, devotion, love, these kind of Newmanesque terms, for both God and for the abbot who rules in God's name. So it's this monastic spirit, political and poetical, which came to England with the Gregorian mission of St. Augustine of Canterbury. Because the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons happened at the hand of monks, monasticism is really vital to the history of Christian England, and you can really see the influence of monasticism very specifically and almost unadulterated in early England. As Bede recounts time and again in his ecclesial history, from the time of St. Augustine, the royal families were the primary targets of missionary activities, and the royal courts were the centers from which the conversion of England was achieved. Christopher Dawson offers really a primary justification for this. Why go after the kings, essentially? He writes, "However small was the political power of the king, he was the keystone of the social structure, and his conversion to Christianity was the symbol and pledge of the conversion of his people." Dawson argues that for the Anglo-Saxons, kingship was a social and religious rather than a political institution. He says, quote, "The king was not primarily a governor and a lawgiver, but the head and the symbolic representative of his people. He was the embodiment of the life of the nation and the life of the land. He was the representative of the people to God, and he represented God to the people by virtue of his sacred office," end quote. The Anglo-Saxons were thus a heroic society. The king then was to be the model of the heroic ideal of his kingdom. This was true for the ancient pagan as much as it was for the Christian king in Anglo-Saxon society. So I bring this up because we may begin to notice that the image of the Anglo-Saxon warrior hero king has a profound similarity in its nature to the office of the abbot. Like the abbot, the king's primary means of rule was to inspire that admiration, enthusiasm, devotion, and love in his subjects. This actually made monasticism attractive to the Anglo-Saxons. In fact, Dawson argues that the parallels between the pagan tribal roots of Anglo-Saxon kingship and the figure of the abbot is one reason monasticism flourished in England. Edgar takes this even a step further in his rule. Under Edgar, the Christian king takes on an actual abbatial identity. Indeed, the abbatial authority is one of the defining features of King Edgar's reign, towards which we'll now turn our attention. First, a bit about Edgar. When Edgar became King of England and Bretwalda, the overlord of Britain, in 959, he inherited a kingdom without a unifying culture. Continuous Viking raids beginning in the late 8th century before finally being driven out of England in the early 10th did much to dismantle the high Christian culture which flourished in England in what we call the Age of Bede. Alfred the Great did much to reorient Christian consciousness towards the cultivation of its Christian culture, especially by attempts to revive monastic life in England. But Alfred's project undoubtedly achieved its high watermark under King Edgar. He assumed the throne at only 16 years old, and the Viking threat temporarily neutralized. And Edgar set about unifying English culture under the banner of Christianity, and in particular, under Benedictine monasticism. He was a devout Christian since his youth, and so Edgar and his closest advisor, St. Dunstan, a Benedictine monk who had spent some years in reformed monasteries on the continent, began implementing a plan to resurrect monastic life in England, which had been basically wiped out because of the Viking raids. What Dunstan had seen on the continent was a strict observance of Benedict's rule among reformed monasteries and the subsequent flourishing of those monasteries. It was this form of Benedictine monasticism that Dunstan intended to establish in England. All told, Edgar, with the support of Dunstan, founded over 40 monasteries for men and women. In order to ensure that the rule was being faithfully followed in each of the monasteries, Edgar convened a synod, the Council of Winchester, from which issued the document, the Regularis Concordia. The Regularis Concordia, or the monastic agreement of the monks and nuns of the English nation, sets a standard for religious life in all of England based on St. Benedict's rule. One of the most unique features of the Regularis Concordia in terms of the rest of the West is how closely it aligned church and state, even by medieval standards. And because monasticism shared in the national life of England, really without parallel elsewhere in Europe, church and state intermingled in unique, overtly monastic ways. Edgar, Dunstan, and all the reformers saw the Benedictine monastic life as the highest form of Christian life. They also saw that the regular form of Christian life of the rule could provide a much-needed unity of culture to the kingdom. This program was not merely pragmatic, however. Medieval notions of Christian kingship, which had already begun to emerge by the time of Edgar, taught that a nation ought to be comprised of a holy people with a good king, part of whose goodness is securing his and their salvation, the salvation of his people. This holy and unified English culture would manifest itself in two ways under Edgar. First, Edgar would take on not only a priestly or sacramental role, but an abbatial identity as king. And second, the episcopal structures, the bishops, the cathedrals, would be dominated by monks. These two forces would, in the eyes of the reformers, unite England around a distinctly monastic Christianity, and it would lead to the salvation of the English soul. Medieval notions of kingship stressed that a king was charged by God for the salvation of his people, and the king's own salvation was dependent on his zeal for the sanctity of his realm. Edgar would fulfill his abbatial identity and his responsibility in this way in several ways. The Regularis Concordia recognized the king and queen as ex officio patrons and guardians of the entire monastic institute, all the monasteries of England. This patronage would have made the king and queen the sort of spiritual father and mother, the abbot and abbess primates, so to speak, of all monasteries in England. All the monasteries would have essentially been under his charge. This patronage would have been further cemented in the special prayers for Edgar and his consort said after every portion of the divine office, together with the Mass for the same intention. This integration of kingship and liturgy would have given to the intercessory prayers of all the monks a strongly national sentiment. Further, the Regularis Concordia established the rules concerning the election of abbot. First, of course, elections must follow the rule of St. Benedict, but really astonishingly, elections were valid only with the advice and consent of the king. This remarkable regulation ensured virtually no separation between the political order and the monastic order, especially as monks took a larger role in governance within the kingdom. It also suggests that Edgar was not merely a bystander to the reform and to the cultivation of Christian life in England, but was really central to it. The public image of Edgar in literary, legal, and religious documents was abbatial in its form as well. The frontispiece of the Regularis Concordia shows the king dressed as an abbot and enthroned between two monks, St. Dunstan and St. Aethelwald. Each hold part of a single scroll of the Regularis Concordia. The explicit message here is that kings were like bishops and abbots, bishops were like kings, and all worked together for the good of the people of God. Even more striking is the frontispiece of the New Minster Charter, an early monastery to be put under the rule of St. Benedict in the reign of Edgar. Edgar, holding the charter, offers it to Christ above, who is seated in glory. On either side of Edgar are the two patron saints of the abbey, the Virgin Mary and St. Peter. The inscription reads, "Thus he who established the stars sits on a lofty throne. King Edgar, prostrate and venerating, adores him." The dual kingships here of Christ and Edgar are pretty explicit, and those reflect standard medieval notions of kingship. But implicit, and I think more unique, is the notion that this monastery in some sense belongs to Edgar. He's the one who's presenting the charter of the new Benedictine foundation to Christ as a symbol of his own obedience to Christ. He's being a good Christian king precisely by overseeing the revitalization of monastic life in England. The most dramatic image of Edgar's abbatial authority, though, would be his coronation ceremony at Bath. The coronation took place in 973, 14 years after Edgar's ascension to the throne, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recounts that the coronation occurred on Pentecost following Edgar's 30th birthday. The symbolism is hard to miss here. Priestly ordinations occurred on Pentecost, and only men who reached the age of 30 were permitted to be ordained. So Edgar was taking on a really sacramental, even priestly role as king here. The coronation followed the lines of the abbatial coronation established by St. Dunstan, right? So now not only is he taking on the sacramental character, but the actual coronation itself is happening in the same way that abbots were now elevated to that role, right? So the symbolism would have been hard to miss for the Christians and for everybody present for the coronation, which the coronation then is the same coronation or the same lines that we currently use in England today with the Queen. However important these symbols of monastic imagery were for the Anglo-Saxon society, the integration of monasticism and political life extended beyond the symbolic into actual governance. One of the most unique features of the Regularis Concordia is the stipulation that where a monastic community serves a cathedral church, it shall elect its own bishop, who shall conform his life in all respects to the monastic rule. This stipulation is without parallel in the Western Church, that the majority of bishops were monks had to have a profound influence on the life of the church at large. They served not only as a symbol of the Christian life, but really as governing the entire episcopal structures. In politics, the presence of the monk bishops and abbots in the Witan, which was the supreme consultative and legislative body in matters spiritual and temporal, made the monastic body predominant in the church. So the monks now would have had profound authority to actually create legislation and to govern the kingdom. This did a lot to unify English political culture in the 10th century. And so I'll start my conclusion here as I run out the clock. What do we take from this, and in particular, how might this inform our conversation surrounding the Benedict option? The first, and I think the most obvious way, is that monks are essential to the flourishing of Christian civilization. They provide a lived model of the ideal Christian life, the life that I've deemed here, following Newman, as poetic. They're thus irreplaceable. This demands, then, our second key takeaway. Monastic life flourishes under the strict observance of the rule. This is not a mere wish of, an Orthodox Catholic. It's just a historical fact. Third, though they are models of the Christian life, monasteries did not transform Western civilization simply by existing. The monks were actively involved in political and episcopal life, as the English Benedictine reform demonstrates. This leads me to two final thoughts for us to consider, with which I'll conclude. What the Benedict option could truly look like is more Orthodox monasteries with a public dimension, right? Monks who champion Orthodox Catholicism, good episcopal governance, and just law. We could also consider the Benedict option in an entirely different capacity. Edgar believed that monks would make the best bishops because their habits, indeed their souls, were formed according to the greatest guide to the Christian life, the rule of St. Benedict. The monk bishops were not only accountable to a higher ecclesial authority, they swore obedience to the rule, which demanded of them the virtuosity of a regular life. If Orthodox religious orders continued to attract vocations, then theologians and church leaders might consider the role that monasteries of the strict observance have in episcopal governance. Doing so could be a great boon not only for the restoration of virtue in our church, but also for the restoration of a poetic and public symbol of the ideal Christian life, a symbol desperately needed today. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Robert Ingram. He is a professor in the history department at Ohio University and director of the George Washington Forum on American Ideals, Politics, and History. He specializes in early modern British religious, political, and intellectual history. He has published Reformation Without End, Religion, Politics, and the Past and Post-Revolutionary England and Religion, Reform and Modernity in the 18th Century, and he is currently working on a book project called Hobbes' Century, England, Ireland, and Religious Establishment. His paper is A Higher Power Than Truth.
Thanks, Raul. Dozens of believers huddled together in a windowless basement room on a beautiful fall Saturday afternoon. I suspect you're all here for one reason. You've chosen the drear option. I, alas, am not Rod, though like Rod, I am from Louisiana, and he's from South Louisiana, which is filled with Cajuns and Catholics, and I'm from North Louisiana, filled with pine trees and Protestants. But today unites all of us Louisianians as the Alabama Crimson Tide head into Death Valley tonight as 14.5-point favorites against the LSU Tigers. Hating the Alabama football team is a Louisianian's birthright. But the person who's brought us all here together, Carter Sneed, is a rabid Alabama fan. And furthermore, he has a lot of time for Alabama's head coach, Nick Saban, who he assures me is a devout, Mass-going Catholic and, all appearances notwithstanding, a decent person. Not wishing to violate the sacred guest-host relationship, I want to use my time here this morning instead to engage with the work of two other Notre Dame faculty and friends, Patrick Neen and Brad Gregory, about the nature of the state and liberal regimes. Both Gregory and Deneen argue that in modern liberal regimes, there's functionally a higher power than truth, and that's the state. It's a hard conclusion to dispute, but as I hope to illustrate through an admittedly careful case study of anti-blasphemy legislation, there are reasons to press harder on their explanations of when and why the liberal state became what it is. Both Deneen and Gregory have written searching books in which they've tried to flesh out what's wrong with liberalism, and both locate the origin of modern liberalism's problems in the early modern period. Dean reckons Hobbes and Locke are the liberal baddies, for Hobbes and Locke conceived of human beings as rights-bearing creatures who needed to be granted liberty, which Dean characterizes as the absence of obstacle to the fulfillment of desires or will or appetite. And what could protect our rights and ensure our liberty? Leviathan. For Gregory, the rot set in with William of Ockham, whose philosophical presuppositions the Protestant reformers accepted. The Protestant Reformation these sort of Ockhamists led shattered Christendom's epistemological consensus and unintentionally catalyzed the creation of our hyper-pluralistic world. In it, there can be no consensus about big questions, not just about how we should live, but about why we should live how we live. Faced with the logical impossibility of consensus, and the consequent subjectivization of morality and politicization of every aspect of human life, and the prospect of potentially bloody disagreements over the big questions of life, liberal Western states have simultaneously and paradoxically preached toleration while practicing intolerance. They arbitrarily dictate what should and should not be tolerated, even what can and cannot be publicly expressed. In liberal regimes, everything is subordinated to the universal, formal, and foundational ethical imperatives of individual and liberty, which means that liberal states in turn have become increasingly legalistic and coercive in order to ensure stability and security. For both Deneen and Gregory, then, there's something inexorably tyrannical in the logic of liberalism and in the purpose of liberal regimes that makes them more coercive as liberal societies become ever more pluralistic. In addition to not being Rod Dreher, I'm not Brad Gregory or Patrick Deneen, which is to say I'm not a historian with formal philosophical training, nor am I a political philosopher. I am, like Key Rock from that old SNL skit, a simple and frozen caveman historian. But no less than Patrick or Brad, I'm hunting for the source of our current rot, if I'm hunting in slightly different methods and in a slightly different patch of the early modern past than they. That patch of the past lies in England during the century after the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, and much in English society fundamentally changed after the Revolution, not least the creation of a fiscal military state. The relationship of church to state also morphed. The Church of England remained legally established, but some forms of Protestant nonconformity were legally countenanced after the Toleration Act of 1689. The Revolution also occasioned awakening of pre-publication censorship, so that after 1695, authors could publish without official imprimatur. Unsurprisingly, contemporaries soon fretted England was awash in heretical publications, and it's against this backdrop that English MPs tried to stifle the production of blasphemous literature. What became clear, though, was that defending truth was not Parliament's highest priority. Preserving the civil peace was, and understanding how this so requires us getting a little bit into the weeds, but it also requires remembering that 18th century England was not a hyper-pluralistic society, but a deeply Christian one. Heterodoxy was rare, and atheism almost non-existent. And yet we see the early 18th century nascent liberalish state making many of the same moves we see its fully mature descendants making today. So, the law. In 1721, the House of Lords took up a bill for the more effectual suppressing of blasphemy and profaneness. It replicated the title of a 1698 bill of that same piece of same legislation commonly referred to as the Blasphemy Act, and it addressed problems that many saw in that early legislation. The 1698 Act's preamble contended that many persons have of late years openly and avowedly published many blasphemous and impious opinions contrary to the doctrines and principles of the Christian religion. English judges had identified blasphemy as a common law crime, or once it had been the preserve of church courts. In Rex v. Taylor of 1676, Matthew Hale famously held that wicked and blasphemous words were not only an offense to God and religion, but a crime against the laws, state, and government, and therefore punishable in this court. The reason for this was that to say religion is a cheat is to dissolve all those obligations whereby civil societies are preserved, and that Christianity is a parcel of the laws of England. And therefore to reproach the Christian religion is to speak in subversion of the law. The The civil magistrate then needed to suppress blasphemy to preserve the civil peace. As Hale explained it, the reasonableness and indeed the necessity of this coercion in matters of religion is apparent, but the concerns of religion and the civil state are so twisted with one another that confusion, disorder, and anarchy in the former must necessarily introduce confusion and disillusion in the latter. What legally constituted blasphemy resisted precise definition, but Hale and other judges were explicit that public expressions of blasphemy threatened the civil order. In the 1695 Act, the English Parliament legislated what constituted blasphemous and impious opinions. In particular, it prescribed public attempts to deny any one of the persons of the Holy Trinity to be God, or to assert or maintain that there are more gods than one, or to deny the Christian religion to be true, or the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be of divine authority. These propositions concern truth's content, the nature of the Christian God, and truth's foundation, the revealed sources of Christian belief. Professing legally prescribed untruths ran one afoul of civil authorities, and those found guilty of writing, printing, teaching, or advised speaking them were barred from any ecclesiastical, civil, or military employment. Second offenses got you 3 years in prison. In 1698, then, Parliament legislated what was and was not true and imposed civil penalties upon those convicted of writing, publishing, or teaching what it had deemed to be untrue. Why? Here, the legislation was unambiguously clear and parroted Hale's Rex v. Taylor rationale. Blasphemy greatly tended to the dishonor of Almighty God and may prove destructive of the peace and welfare of this kingdom. Truth was worth protecting, not simply because it was true, but because untruth threatened the civil peace. Truth's fate and the state's fate, then, were bound up together. In 1698, blasphemy legislation passed into law. In 1721, it didn't. In 1698, a decided parliamentary majority supported legally defining blasphemy and prosecuting blasphemers in civil courts. In 1721, 2/3 of the lords, and more bishops than not, refused to accept a more precise definition of blasphemy or a more expansive prosecution of blasphemers and their publishers. So what had changed? Parliament's determination to maintain the civil peace had not. What had changed instead was what most in Parliament thought constituted civil peace, what most in Parliament thought threatened civil peace, and what most in Parliament thought should be done with perceived threats to civil peace. Moreover, what had changed in the 2 decades after the 1698 Act's passage was that the established church itself was riven even more deeply, not simply about how to deal with public expressions of untruth, but about what even constituted truth and untruth. Indeed, one of the striking things about the 1721 Blasphemy Bill was that many of its chief opponents were clerics who believed that heresy and blasphemy were real, were clerics who believed that early 18th century abounded with heretics and blasphemers, and were clerics who would actually later prove willing to act on that belief. And yet they voted down a piece of legislation that promised to punish heretics and blasphemers. The Lord's debate in 1721 highlighted the salient issues, and the 3 most important concerned morality, truth, and the state's role in securing both. Both the 1689 Act and the 1721 bill got drawn up during periods of perceived moral crisis, but while a perceived sense of national crisis might have been given salience to their concerns about truth, the fractious public debates about a central Christian truth claim, the Son's eternity, begottenness, and consubstantiality, made that legislation necessary in the eyes of its architects. Both the 1698 Act and the 1721 bill were legislative measures designed to resolve a debate about the Christian God's nature by preventing debates about the Christian God's nature. The Church of England's official self-conception committed it to the formulation of God's nature as expressed in the Nicene Creed, and the English state's alliance with the Church in turn obliged it to defend Nicene orthodoxy. The Trinitarian debates during the first 3 decades of the 18th century covered no new ground. Indeed, defenders of Nicene orthodoxy would have argued there was no truly innovative position to be had regarding God's nature, and that any innovative position was necessarily untrue, since the Nicene Creed was the primitively pure articulation of God's nature. Instead, the Trinitarian debates were debates about scholarship and discipline, ones firstly about which scholarly methods and sources could confirm or reprove or the Nicene articulation of God's nature, and one secondly about who had the authority to defend the Nicene articulation against doubters and to what lengths that defense might go. The 1721 Blasphemy Bill was part of those debates. The bill's crafting coincided with a pamphlet by the person who'd actually written the Toleration Act, someone named the Earl of Nottingham, in which Nottingham defended the Nicene and Athanasian creeds. Relevant here is what damage he thought might flow from public espousals of Christological heterodoxy. There were individual soteriological consequences. Worse still were the corporate consequences attending public expressions of Christological heresy. Arianism, for instance, had laid the foundation of Mohammedanism, and it produced an ill effect upon the Jews by hardening them into their infidelity and blasphemy. More recently, Arians had encouraged skeptics of this age who deny all revealed religion. All of these were religious innovators, and religious innovators most reckoned had torn apart English society during the 1640s and 50s in its bloody civil wars. Civil peace, then, required restraining public expressions of untruth. Ideally, the clerical convocation, a part of Parliament, would be allowed to sit and act in the care of that flock of Christ, of which the Holy Ghost has made them overseers, in which the laws of the lands have committed them. But England's secular rulers had blocked convocation from conducting meaningful business after 1717, precisely because they believed the clergy's public deliberations and convocations threatened the civil peace. If the Christologically heterodox were to be disciplined, the civil magistrate would have to do it. The common law courts offered one option, and the Court of King's Bench tried 19 cases for blasphemous libel between 1689 and 1720, reaching 7 guilty verdicts. Yet most reckon this was only a fraction of the blasphemous works published. The conclusion that exemplary punishments had been ineffective drove the 1721 legislative effort to clamp down on public expressions of anti-Trinitarianism. One of the chief promoters of that bill was the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man named William Wake. Wake offered a history of blasphemy's growth in England and a rationale for the bill that were Hobbesian to the core. Firstly, he said, the Toleration Act had expressly not tolerated anyone who expressed views to the prejudice of these fundamental doctrines of the Trinity. Anti-Trinitarians, by implication, were fair game. Secondly, he professed concern only with outward expression. I desire not to inquire into any man's private opinions, he insisted, but let them not disturb nor infect others with them. Thirdly, as the nation's established church, the Church of England deserved the state's protection. Establishments, whether in things sacred or civil, are to be supported, not attacked by private persons, much less to be done so where so much liberty is allowed in matters of religion. Would men be content to be quiet and enjoy their own opinions without disturbing the public? This, he insisted, was not persecution, but prosecution. The controversy here is not with weakness, but weakness of men, he pled. I'm willing to allow as much to men's errors, innocent errors, as any. I hate persecution, but I'm not willing to be frightened with the cry of persecution where there's no ground for it. Here is none, unless it be persecution to bring malefactors to judgment. Because blasphemy was a crime of volition, a crime of deliberate and active choice, it merited deliberative and active punishment. The blasphemy bill as such proposed merely to strengthen the laws already in force, not to look back but forward, not to restrain men's opinions, but the attempts and actions. That restraint, Wake argued, would preserve the peace of religion. Wake, surely no fan of the monster of Malmesbury, could hardly have done a better job of ventriloquizing Hobbes's prescriptions for maintaining the civil peace. Why then did the bill get voted down in the Lords? No one in the parliamentary debate denied Christ's divinity. Instead, every opposition speaker claimed the bill would make church and state persecutors. As one Whig lord put it, he was as much against blasphemy and promoting religion as it is professed in the Church of England as anybody, but he could not be for any law which was for persecution, of which nature he took this bill to be. Prosecuting untruth on this view was not prosecution, but persecution. The last lay lord to appeal the bill was the Venerable Earl of Peterborough, who declared that though he was for a parliamentary king, yet he did not desire to have a parliamentary God or a parliamentary religion. And if this house was for such a one, he would go to Rome and endeavor to be chosen a cardinal, for he would rather sit in that conclave than with his lordships upon these terms. Peterborough made the commonplace Protestant and Whig case about an inherent connection between persecution and popery. Coercion made persecution possible, and coercion's opposite was liberty, which Whigs valorized. Implicit in Peterborough's speech was that the blasphemy bill's supporters favored coercion, while its supporters favored liberty. State-imposed religious beliefs resulted from coercion, while allowing people freedom to discern the truth resulted from liberty. And yet it was the case that England had a parliamentary God and a parliamentary religion. The Church of England, after all, had been established by 16th century parliamentary statutes, and full civil and political rights depended on publicly adhering to religious views stipulated by 17th century statutes. The Whig lay lords who opposed the blasphemy bill then could hardly have done so because of some principled commitment to religious liberty. Instead, they aimed above all to preserve the civil peace and reckoned prosecuting blasphemers was more disruptive than simply letting them alone. Yet the opposition to the 1720 bill came not just from lay lords, but from within the established church itself. And the post-revolution settlement had been one in which Whig churchmen had made a deal, one which protected the church establishment status, but one which highlighted the perennial post-Reformation questions about the proper relationship of church to state. Was the church an independent, equal, or subordinate partner to the state? Did the church enjoy its establishment status by grace or by right? Most argued the latter, but suspected the former, and that meant that protecting the church's interests required delicacy. Against this backdrop, the bishops thought about the 1721 bill. The most forceful clerical opponent was the Bishop of London, a man named Edmund Gibson, and I'll only single out one strand of his arguments against the bill, a strand which he said concerned the authority, government, and discipline of the church. Gibson set out to refute the arguments of Erastians, who own no power in the church but that of the civil magistrate, of papists who assert greater powers to the church than Christ has given, and of some Protestants concerning the particular forms of government which the apostles instituted in the church. To these, Gibson added a fourth, erroneous conception of the church's authority and discipline, a latecomer voluntarist one. This new scheme he intended is equally against the three, excluding the civil magistrate from any concern whatsoever in matters of religion as such, and denying at the same time that Christ has any government or governors in his church upon earth, and affirming that no more is needful to become a Christian than for every particular person in his own mind to believe Christ to be the Messiah. Against voluntarism, Erastianism, popery, and anti-Episcopalian Protestants, Gibson defended the true apostolical scheme of Christ. Gibson believed that there were blasphemers in the Church of England of his day and that they needed to be prosecuted. But he also recognized that the church needed the state to prosecute blasphemers and that those who helped them to propagate their blasphemy. As he put it in the run-up to one blasphemy trial in 1729, he had delivered to the person on whose judgment they depend in criminal prosecutions a large extract of blasphemous passages out of that author's books in order to consider of the most proper and effectual methods to do justice upon printers, publishers, etc., agreeably to the usual practice of the state for the discouraging of seditious pamphlets. The key phrase is agreeably to the usual practice of the state, for blasphemy could only remain a common law crime in the state if the state continued to recognize it as one, and furthermore was willing to prosecute it in its courts. Some have quipped that there's no blasphemy without the law. In post-revolutionary England, it could be more precise to say there's no blasphemy without the state. The Glorious Revolution had set in train a series of events which confirmed the Church of England as England's civil religion. And William Wake, the Archbishop, would have liked to have managed that relationship between church and state on terms that acknowledged the church's status as an independent corporate body. But by the 720s, he recognized that Erastian notions and an indifference to all things that concern the state of the church and religion made that impractical. Edmund Gibson, for his part, increasingly recognized that the Church of England, if it hoped to continue as the nation's civil religion, it would need at times to place the state's interest in ensuring the civil order above its own in defending truth. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Rod Dreher. He is a writer, blogger, commentator, and the author of the landmark book, The Benedict Option. He is the editor of The American Conservative and has contributed writings on politics, religion, culture, and film to outlets such as National Review Online and the Wall Street Journal. Among various TV interviews, he has appeared on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and prominently covered the Catholic sex abuse scandals in Boston in 2002. Dreher has toured and spoken on the Benedict Option in numerous settings since its publication, including here at Notre Dame, and it was well received. The title of his paper today is Solzhenitsyn and St. Benedict, What Orthodox Christianity Brings to the Benedict Option.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for coming out on this most sacred and terrible day of the autumn calendar, the time when we commemorate the cosmic clash of good and evil, the LSU-Alabama game. I wish to assure you on behalf of my friend and colleague Robert Ingram that tonight at the closing event, which unfortunately begins just at kickoff in Baton Rouge, that if you see us with our heads folded down, we're not watching the game or following the game on our iPhones. We're in fact in prayer, because we're just that pious. So what's wrong with the modern world? In his Templeton address, Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that it's because, quote, men have forgotten God. What does he mean by that? Solzhenitsyn, who was a devout Russian Orthodox Christian, is telling us that in the modern era, men have lost consciousness of the divine dimension of our lives, of the eternal, of the transcendent. From that, all other disorders come. And not only that, but we also, because we've forgotten God, we lack the means to restore order and harmony. Now, it's not that pre-modern times were any sort of golden age. The first and last utopia ended when Adam and Eve tasted the fruit in the Garden of Eden. The point is that a society that has forgotten God has abandoned the source of its moral and social order. More significantly, from a Christian point of view, the godless society has turned its back on reality itself. This conviction that men have forgotten God is at the basis of what I call the Benedict Option. The gist of the argument is this: Christians must recognize that the West is now a decidedly post-Christian civilization, by which I mean that the West, our civilization, no longer understands itself according to the Christian narrative. The collapse of the Christian religion in the West is an event as epical as the 5th century collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. Those Christians who want to endure in the faith and pass it on to their kids through this new dark age will need to study the practices of the Benedictine monks who emerged out of Rome's collapse. Those monks kept the faith and cultural memory alive through a time of darkness and chaos, and they laid the groundwork for the rebirth of civilization. The Benedict Option is the choice that all Christians in this time and place must make to read the signs of the times and to commit themselves to intentionally countercultural Christian living, and to do so in various forms of community. As Father Cassian Folsom, the retired prior of the Benedictine monastery in Norcia, told me, Christians who do not do some form of this will not have what it takes to make it through what is to come with their faith intact. The evidence that Christianity is collapsing in the West is beyond dispute. Certainly, the faith is declining steeply in terms of quantity, that is, the numbers of people professing the faith and living it out. It is also declining even more steeply in terms of quality. Very many people who profess Christianity today have little idea what that means historically, theologically, and otherwise. The best work on this phenomenon, by the way, has been done here at Notre Dame by Christian Smith, who has documented that the true religion of most American young people, and I would say older people too, is what he calls moralistic therapeutic deism. Basically, this is a feel-good, generic form of Christianity that sees personal happiness and well-being and being nice to others as the greatest good. MTD has little to do with historic Christianity, but it is the only form of Christianity that most modern Americans know. This is a much greater crisis than many of us realize. In the current issue of First Things, the Catholic philosopher Michael Hanby says that we are living through a massive paradigm shift in the West, one that within the church goes far deeper than the standard critiques you hear from progressive and conservative Catholics. The crisis is metaphysical. We have forgotten the divine dimension of reality, he says. In the Catholic Church, you can see this in the loss of a sense of holiness and transcendence in the liturgy. But it's not only that. It has to do with the way people in our time and place apprehend reality itself. This is not a bug in modernity. This is a feature. The historian Yuval Noah Harari has described modernity as a contract in which we exchange meaning for power. That is, we surrender the idea that there is any such thing as a transcendent order to which we are responsible, and in turn, we gain the power to do whatever we like with that order, with our bodies and with creation. The evidence is abundantly clear that this way of seeing the world is so common in the West, even among Christians, that we scarcely notice it. Now, it's important to note that for Solzhenitsyn, the cause of our calamity is forgetting. The social anthropologist Paul Connerton, who teaches at Cambridge, has described modernity as a time of, quote, forced forgetting. And he even cites Solzhenitsyn as an exemplar of the struggle of memory against the forced forgetting of modernity. Connerton also describes a modern condition as one of, quote, structured amnesia. That is, the habits and institutions of modernity train us all to cast aside anything that binds the autonomous self and hinders its quest for satisfaction, for self-realization by making its desires concrete. Eventually, a people who are so catechized and formed will forget to ask themselves the kind of questions that formed their traditions. And this, I argue, is where Western Christianity is today. I have proposed the Benedict option based loosely on monastic practices as a strategy of sustained Christian remembering. If modernity brings about structured amnesia, then Christianity under the Benedict option is about structured remembrance. The rule of St. Benedict is perhaps the ultimate expression of this, but all Christians must live within some meaningful form of sustained remembering. Connerton is a leading scholar of social memory, and unfortunately, I don't have time today to go into depth about his ideas. So I commend to you his 1989 book called How Societies Remember. In the book, Connerton explores how distinct peoples within modernity come to construct their identities out of collective memory. In brief, he says that those societies that manage to hold on to their identities despite the pressures of modernity have several characteristics in common. One, they share a common story that they believe tells them who they are. Second, they enact that story in various concrete ways, most particularly in a ritualistic telling of that story. Third, in that chief ritual, the people who participated in it must believe that it's not merely a recollection, but in some way the ritual puts them in contact with the eternal and the transcendent. That is, the ritual must not only reveal the hidden order of being, but must also provide a means for the people to join themselves to it. And fourth, the communal story must become what he calls a habit memory, in the sense that the community must make that memory reflexive through various incarnational means, that is, through art, through music, through rituals that involve the body. The community story must be, in Connerton's phrase, quote, sedimented into the body. Sedimented into the body. Connerton writes that habit is a knowledge and a remembering in the hands and in the body. Well, it should be clear, at least to the Catholics in this room, that the traditional Catholic faith contains all of these elements. So why are so many Catholics today falling away from the church? Studies have shown that if not for the influx in this country of Hispanic Catholics through migration, the U.S. Catholic Church would be losing people at the same rate as mainline Protestant churches. The fact is that in practice, if not in theory, contemporary Catholicism has betrayed its best self, has turned its back on its greatest traditions. Now, whenever I speak on Christian college campuses, both evangelical and Catholic, I hear the same complaint from professors that these kids come to us knowing nothing or next to nothing about the Christian faith. Evangelicals are a little better off, I find, for reasons that are sociological, not theological. But I agree with the Southern Baptist theologian Albert Mohler, who said that contemporary evangelicals do not have within their traditions the deep resources to resist the scattering forces of modernity. Catholics do, however, but they're not using them. Maybe they've forgotten that these things exist at all. My claim is that Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which, by the way, did not absorb nominalism, can offer to Catholics and Protestants a host of resources within the Benedict Option to keep memory of the Christian story alive and to strengthen the resistance of the faithful during this post-Christian time of testing. Let me put my cards on the table. As a lot of you know, I'm a convert to Eastern Orthodox Christianity from Roman Catholicism. I was an adult convert to Catholicism and practiced faithfully for 13 years. I lost my Catholic faith as the result of covering the abuse scandal. And I would say by having left myself vulnerable by making my Catholic faith primarily an intellectual matter, not something sedimented into my body. God gave me a second chance, though, out of my brokenness, this time in Orthodoxy, which I've been practicing for almost 13 years now. To be clear, I do not believe Orthodox churches are without sin, nor am I trying to convert anyone to Orthodoxy today. Whether or not Orthodox Christian theological claims are true is obviously of fundamental importance. But what I want to share with you today are a few lessons I have learned from the study and practice of Orthodox Christianity in contemporary America, with the hope that my Catholic and Protestant brothers and sisters will be able to benefit from them within their own traditions in tangible ways. After all, Orthodoxy has an extremely small presence in the West. The ability of we who follow Orthodox Christianity in the West to thrive depends on the health and the strength of Catholics and Protestants to do so as well. Now, the thing that strikes an attentive Western newcomer to Orthodoxy is how strongly the Orthodox have retained the sacramental vision at a concrete level, especially in the emphasis that we know God primarily, not only, but primarily through experience. This is precisely the thing that, according to Michael Hanby, we in the West have forgotten. Hanby says very slyly in his piece that, quote, "We await a new and doubtless very different Maximus the Confessor." The contemporary Orthodox theologian Dimitris Staniloaou explains that the 7th century theologian Maximus the Confessor taught that all created things conceal, quote, divine logoi within them, as so many rays of the supreme logos. He who discovers them in things ascends on their thread to the knowledge of God, and this knowledge must anticipate his direct knowledge, unquote. Staniloaou continues, "Salvation isn't obtained in isolation, but in a cosmic frame. This value of the world as a road to God is explained by the fact that man must have an object of giant proportions for strengthening his spiritual forces, but also from the intrinsic structure of the world as a symbol of transcendent divine realities. A symbol, from the Greek symbolein, to throw together, to unite two things without confusing them, is a visible reality which doesn't only represent, but somehow makes unseen reality visible. A symbolic consciousness of the world," he says, "sees everywhere in this world the signs and symbols of another world, and perceives the divine as the mysterious and infinite, beyond that which is finite and transitory," close quote. The awareness of the interpenetration of the material and spiritual worlds was common in pre-modern Christianity, though we have largely lost that natural sense of apprehending that today. This is why the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which the Orthodox celebrate every Sunday, can be such a staggering experience for people coming to it for the first time. That ancient liturgy focuses on the transcendent dimension and is consciously understood by Orthodox worshipers to be where heaven and earth meet in sight, in sound, in ritual, and of course, above all, in the Eucharist. This is what Catholics believe about the Holy Mass too, of course, but the contrast between the Novus Ordo Mass in most Catholic parishes today and the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is vast. I'm not speaking of a theological difference, but rather of the phenomenon, the aesthetic phenomenon of liturgical worship. Orthodoxy has a reputation for being more mystical than Western churches are, and I think that's a deserved reputation. The Orthodox believe quite strongly that as soon as one steps into an Orthodox church, one should recognize that one has stepped out of the everyday world into the heavenly realm. The church, rightly seen, is a meeting place of heaven and earth. In the Orthodox imagination, as I've just said, everything in creation is a symbol of God. But entering into a church concentrates that awareness. Orthodox Christianity believes that the form of earthly worship corresponds to heavenly worship. This is why we Orthodox do not believe that we're at liberty to muck around with the liturgy, to make it easier for modern people to get something out of it, to reach people where they are. Along these lines, the divine liturgy, true to Paul Connerton's criteria, has been largely unchanged over the centuries and is regarded by Orthodox as untouchable. We don't make the liturgy makes us. Robert Louis Wilken, the great modern historian of the early church, who's a Catholic, has observed that religious rituals carry a resonance of human feeling accumulated over the centuries. They cannot be easily created and are hard to recover once left to languish. Western Christians can rediscover older forms of Christian worship within their own traditions. If you quit trying to dumb down everything to make it comprehensible to the untutored, if you call people out of themselves to something higher and eternal. As Hanby points out, when the majesty of God's holiness is absent from the liturgy, fear of the Lord won't long survive. The second thing Western Christians can learn from orthodoxy is the central importance of asceticism. The cultural anthropologist Mary Douglas famously wrote about the foolishness of the post-conciliar Catholic Church doing away with the Friday fast. Alone among Christian traditions in the modern world, Orthodox Christians still fast, twice during the week, but also during periods to prepare for great feasts of the church. Not all of us do it all the time, but fasting is still held to be essential for Christian life. We have to learn, all of us, to say no to ourselves. The Christian life involves a constant striving towards unity with God, and that includes learning how to say no to our bodily passions, and in so doing, recognize and live out and sediment into our bones the primacy of the spiritual over the material. This is not just a good idea. It's necessary to our survival in this world, this materialist world that has forgotten God. As Solzhenitsyn said, quote, "Only voluntary, inspired self-restraint can raise man above the world stream of materialism." A third basic aspect of orthodoxy is the way it cultivates a living awareness of our connection to the past. The early church and the fathers of the church are very much present in the consciousness of Orthodox congregations today. The communion of saints is a key concept in all traditional Christianity, but Orthodox Christianity brings it to an awareness of its people in a sustained way, and not just through the presence of icons in the church. In fact, Orthodoxy regards tradition with a seriousness almost entirely absent in the West. Remembering the saints and their stories becomes part of the habit memory of pious Orthodox Christians. Now, this can easily become traditionalism, defined mischievously by Yaroslav Pelikan as the dead faith of the living. The late Orthodox priest and theologian Alexander Schmemann lamented in his diaries how stuffy and museum-like contemporary Orthodox worship could be. That's absolutely a danger. Tradition is necessary but not sufficient. However, tradition, rightly understood, makes what is permanent and what is eternal present across all ages. To borrow from Connerton's thought, we might call tradition structured remembrance. To conclude, let me make clear that the Benedict Option is not a head-for-the-hills exhortation. We lay people are not called to the monastery, nor is it a Christian panacea for all the disorders in modernity. We Christians will do well simply to hold our own. Rather, the Benedict Option is a call to small O Orthodox Christians to A, recognize the radical threat post-Christian modernity poses to belief, and B, to draw creatively on our traditions to build a thick, local, authentically Christian culture as a robust, resilient alternative to modernity. Robert Wilken, the church historian, warns that the only way we will make it through this crisis is with a, quote, rebirth of moral and spiritual discipline and a resolute effort on the part of Christians to comprehend and defend the remnants of Christian culture. Yes, we need to study Christian culture, but more than that, we need to live it, and not simply in our moral behavior. The forms in which we live out and celebrate our faith have everything to do with whether or not we remember God. This should not be a difficult argument to make to Catholics, who know as well as we Orthodox do that our faith is incarnational. This, I believe, is why Pope Benedict XVI said that the best arguments for the faith are not syllogisms and propositions, but the art that comes from the Church and the saints. That is to say, the truth made incarnate in beauty and goodness, and therefore apprehensible. Almost done. It has become a harder sell to Catholics in the last 50 years because Catholics in the West have been so eager to assimilate to the modern world and to cast aside so many of the traditional devotional practices that make Catholics and their culture distinctive. These practices, no less than Benedictine monasticism, serve the purpose of structured remembering. They both express and inculcate a deeper sacramental mindset, one that helps us remember the truth, that God is everywhere present and fills all things. They teach us that our lives, our daily lives, participate in eternity, that we are responsible to things beyond ourselves, that this knowledge, this godly way of life, is something we have to make our own and to pass on to our children, because the eternal destiny of souls depends on it. This is not running away from the world. Rather, it is acquiring the means as Christians to persist within it. We have no choice but to serve our neighbors by sharing the love of God with them, including, but not limited to, evangelization. But we cannot give to the world what we do not have. And that brings me to the final Orthodox gift to Western Christians in the Benedict Option, Orthodoxy's understanding of the dynamic role personal sanctity plays in the bringing of light to a darkened world. One of the greatest modern Orthodox saints, a wonder-working Russian hermit called Seraphim of Sarov, is famous for saying, quote, "Acquire the Holy Spirit and thousands around you will be saved." It is an expression of a deeply Orthodox insight about the organic way holiness spreads in the world. By seeking constant conversion and deepening your own relationship with God, you cannot help but change the world. As Dumitru Stanilo puts it, the care for one's own formation in Christ and that of our neighbors by beautifying ourselves with virtues doesn't mean a non-participation in the life of the world. It is rather the very fullest collaboration if man is a part of humanity and his formation is the ultimate goal of creation. The person who has reached the peak of spiritual perfection, a saint in other words, exerts an influence and an attraction on his neighbors, which makes them strive to reach the ideal goal. Because the very highest of the virtues with which spiritual man struggles for is love, in love there is knowledge too. Now the love of God cannot be separated from the love of people, close quote. All of this is within the Catholic tradition too. You just have to uncover it, to renew it, and to live it. A dear Catholic friend of mine, Marco Sermarini, who's a hero of my book, The Benedict Option, talked to me for the book about his joy-filled group of traditional Catholics in Italy. He told me, quote, "We invented nothing. We discovered nothing. We only rediscovered what had been stored away from us for so long. We had forgotten," close quote. I hope and pray that we Orthodox Christians can remind our Western brothers and sisters of the power of these buried treasures to help us all remember the God that we have forgotten and to sediment the faith into our bones. As the example of St. Benedict of Nursia and the founding generation of Benedictines show us, everything else follows from that. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have time for questions. If you wouldn't mind just raising your hand and standing up and projecting your voice. And speakers, if you wouldn't mind using the microphone when you respond. One question over here.
Yeah, thank you. Tomáš, I'm a visiting scholar from Hungary, and I've heard Rod Dreher's speech, which he has given in Budapest, and I really liked it. And if I didn't misunderstand, I think you have said that the Benedict Option is something that, in one way or another, even non-believers, non-Catholics, secular people could be alive of, and they could turn to their own kind of Benedict Option in case they are disappointed by the recent developments of modernity. And this brings me to my second point, which is that maybe we should, you have said that the Benedict Option is in a large part about creating the culture of remembering our own values and beliefs. So I think this should be opened up, and it shouldn't be only about our Catholic and Christian values and doctrines that we hold to be true, but also about history, intellectual history, literature, and so on and so forth. For example, I've recently been in Belgium, and I just found out that, as I know, the kids are not taught history in secondary schools there, which I think is a great loss. So I think this culture of remembrance shouldn't be only about our religion, but also about in general history, both for Catholics and for non-Catholics as well. Because if that's not part of this core of what we want to remember, the general history, then it makes us vulnerable to all kinds of arguments about church, whatever. And my third and last point is that it struck me a little bit when you have said that you converted to Orthodoxy because of the scandals of the church. I think if we learn about general history and learn also about the flows of the Catholic Church in the past, that could prepare us for more recent and present scandals and problems in the church in itself. So we shouldn't just concentrate on the doctrines of the faith and practices, but also on general history and the flows. Thanks.
Is this on? Can you hear?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments. I want to. All right, I want to focus especially on the comment you made about the importance for not just Christians to the project of cultural memory. I'm reminded of something I learned in the process of writing the book, and also going to the Czech Republic when the book was translated and published there earlier this year. Something I learned from the family of Václav Benda. Václav Benda died in the 1990s of cancer, but he was a heroic dissident, anti-communist dissident in the communist years, and the only Christian, he was a Catholic, the only Christian in Václav Havel's circle. The Benda family, 6 kids, they staged a heroic personal resistance to communism as Catholics, because they believed, Václav and Kamila Benda believed that it wasn't enough for Christians to just turn their back to the world and just sort of keep their heads down to go along to get along. They believed that not only was it their responsibility to keep the faith alive, but they also wanted to keep the broader Western tradition alive of literature, of culture, and of art. Václav Benda's basic idea for how to do this was to create a parallel polis. In other words, if Christians, and more broadly speaking, people who had the traditional consciousness and love for the Western civilizational tradition, if they were not allowed to participate in official public life under communism, then they should create parallel structures to keep the tradition alive. So what that meant was that if people weren't allowed to teach traditional literature in college under communism, they should start underground seminars to keep the tradition alive and pass it on to students who are willing to receive it. You don't have to be a Christian to believe that is true. You just have to believe that there is something of great value in the Western tradition, in our literary tradition, our artistic philosophical tradition, and that it is important to keep alive. I talked to Kamila Bendova, the widow of Václav, this past spring. I went to her apartment, and she asked her how they kept the faith alive for their kids. And it wasn't separated just by teaching theology alone to the kids. Rather, it was the whole package. It was teaching literature and art as well. She said every night, even though she taught college herself, she was a mathematician, and even though she had to raise 6 kids when her husband was in prison, she read for at least 2 hours to her children. She read literature. Tolkien was a big favorite of hers. I said, why Tolkien? She said, because we knew that Mordor was real. And her broader point is we have to fortify the imaginations of people in modernity who have forgotten and who have had these things taken away from them, access to the past taken away from them. I've been talking here at Notre Dame to different professors in various Christian universities. We're talking about how more and more within their fields this is being, the tradition is being cast aside for the usual politically correct reasons. I think this is one point where traditional Christians can join with secular people who may not share our faith, but who do share a love and a respect for the Western tradition and who see it under threat today and want to know what we can do to stop that.
Thank you for your talks. This is kind of for Dr. Fisher and Mr. Greer. Oh, okay. So, Dr. Fisher, you were talking about sort of how with the Benedictines, there's sort of a unity of political and spiritual life. And I'm sort of wondering about the modern day where there's a tendency to isolate spiritual life, political life, personal life, and sort of separate these into little aspects of your own life. And I'm wondering how, I guess, the Benedict option or the Benedict life seeks for almost a unity of culture in that sense. Yeah, if you could address
Sure, yeah, I guess I would say a couple of things. First, I don't think it's inherent to St. Benedict himself or to the original vision of Benedictine life that it would be united with political life, right? In fact, like Rod has detailed, it was kind of a rejection and a move away from that. But I guess my point would be two things. First, that as Western civilization developed and Christian civilization developed, it assumed Benedictine forms and actually used Benedictine life as kind of a political Christian instrument. But I think the broader point is that I think what Benedict shows is that in order to become virtuous, in order to become good, you need the community, right? And you need political forms to help direct the individual towards the good. And so whether that happens with the official support of the polis, of the political community, or whether it happens separate from the political community, you need something to help direct the individual, right? I think what I'm focusing on here is that, you know, in a Christian civilization, you can use Benedictine forms as kind of a symbol, right, for how to live the Christian life. But I think you can do that even without an officially Christian state, right? So that's why I think having monks to remind us kind of that memory that Rob was talking about, right? To have monks to remind us of what it means to be Christian is another way we might think about the Benedict option, right? And how we can be, how we can live the ideal Christian life.
Yeah, I would say that so many Christians, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox, like to think about Christianizing this society through political action. What I would say is we've got to Christianize the church. You know, and I'm not being flip here, but we can look at the statistics. We can look at the evidence of our eyes about how far people who still profess Christianity have drifted from the practice of authentic Christianity. I think that there's an important lesson to learn about politics, and Alistair McIntyre was speaking about this yesterday, about the localization of politics, about localism. We have to ask ourselves, what are politics? Politics, at its most basic level, is how we come together in community to order our common lives. If we, as Christians, feel that we can't, or we don't have the kind of power or influence at the national or the state level to influence the direction of the country, then we can, that's no reason we can't get involved at the local level outside of narrow electoral means or partisan politics as it's generally understood, and instead get involved in doing good works for in our community, coming together to found schools, initiatives to help the poor and things like that. Václav Benda believed that the idea of community was so broken down under communism that simply bringing people together for any reason, come out and to be reminded that they exist as a community was itself a counter-revolutionary act, was a political act for the good. I believe that's one way we should think about it. I should also say that in Dante's Purgatorio, the second book of the Commedia, the character Dante arrives at the level the mountain of purgatory where anger is purged. He meets a man there, Marco the Lombard, and says, Marco, I've come from the earth, and the church is falling apart, families are against family, everything is in chaos and in ruin. Give me some advice I can take back so we can put things together. He's asking basically a political question. Marco tells him, brother, the world is blind and you come from that world too. And he goes on to say that people believe that fate is bringing them to this point. They can't resist fate. But God gave you free will. And he goes on to say that if you exercise this free will for the good, in time, things will begin to change. He says if you want to heal the world, start with your own heart and work out from there. Dante says that much more poetically, but I think there's a really important political lesson in that for us, that reforming the world politically has to begin with repentance and taking on the mind of Christ within ourselves and working out from there.
If you can read the time for words and questions.
This is for Professor Ingram. I don't know if you heard a couple days ago, one of the various rights tribunals over in Europe included the right to free expression is not the right to insult Muhammad. And what was interesting to me is that the kind of animating idea of the court's judgment was not the truth or falsity of the statement, but the offense that might be caused by the statement. And I wonder if the story you told, very interesting story you told, has any lessons for how we should think about this kind of blasphemy by another name that we're seeing in cases like this.
Yeah, good question, Rick. And it requires me to go past, sort of where the bus lines run, at least to my knowledge. I mean, so what I'm, it seems like it's a problem of pluralism, right? I mean, how do you keep order, right? I mean, how does a state maintain some sort of order if offending Muhammad or saying something offensive about Charlie Hebdo or whatever? I mean, if the liberal state, or maybe any state, perceives that, I mean, you think about China, right? The Uyghurs are all, 1 million Uyghurs are stuck in a camp. Is it something about the nature of a modern pluralistic state that just leads it to have to clamp down on any kind of potentially disruptive dissent, which doesn't make me think, so that I find the Benedict Option really, an appealing thing. But I mean, my question, at least listening to you all, is at what point does the Benedict Option itself become disruptive? Right? At what point do these kinds of communities that you both are suggesting we need to do? At what point there's a sort of an almost a Renaissance to the vision that y'all are presenting, which is incredibly appealing. But at some point, some state is going to say you can't do that thing. A Lutheran church, you can't choose you can't say that that you have to be a Lutheran to be a minister, whatever every decision that goes forward. At what point do those intentional communities themselves become problematic in the eyes of the state?
I just want to answer that very quickly. I think you're absolutely right, and that's why some people who criticize the Benedict Option say, aha, but you think the state's going to leave you alone? Yeah, you have another thing coming. No, I don't think that at all. I think at some point they will cause problems, but that's why we need the Benedict Option. So we have, we have sedimented the faith into our bones. We build this resilience internally, and we have built the networks of communal resistance so that when we are persecuted, if it comes to that, we will have what it takes to hold on. The Benda family did not resist communism by just, without having been trained in their day in and day out liturgical practice and devotional practices to be accustomed to another world. And this is when I think the Benedict Option, the strength of it will really show forth, is when we are put to the test. I talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the 3 Hebrew youths who were thrown into the fiery furnace in the book of Daniel for refusing to bow down before Nebuchadnezzar's statue. If you'll remember from the book of Jeremiah, the Hebrews in their Babylonian exile were told to settle there, pray for the peace of the city, integrate yourselves. But their integration into the city was limited. at some point, they put God, the worship of God, above everything else, so that when they were put to the test and were asked to bow down, even though they were servants of the king, bow down or die, they chose death. I hate to be so dramatic, but that's the sort of thing that we need to look for in the Benedict option, and to look into the stories of the martyrs of our own faith. What was it that enabled them to have the strength to choose death before apostasy, before assimilation, before compromise? That's what we need to look for.
Maybe we just have time for one more gentleman.
Thank you very much. My observation is directed mostly to Rod's talk, which I found very persuasive. And your outline of the Benedict option, I think, really resonated with me. So I would take nothing away from it, but I'm going to offer a suggestion for something to add to it. Your concept of sort of structured remembrance included things like goodness and mysticism and sacredness and beauty and tradition and culture. And your observation about many universities and professors' reactions to students is that they know so little. Often we think of faith, and or in terms of reason and faith in a sort of Protestant sense of sola fide. But in this context, it seems to me that we need the intellectual tradition to be added to the mystical tradition, to the sacred tradition, to the cultural tradition. We need that infrastructure, that content to inform the Benedictine community, and even the Benedictine tradition itself unites study with prayer and with work.
Yeah, thank you for that. I completely agree, and this is in fact what Catholics can give to Orthodox Christians, that a greater appreciation for the life of the mind. It's not to say that Orthodoxy has no life of the mind, not at all, but I believe that we do have to have that unifying, that harmonious view. Faith and reason, to separate them is an illusion, I believe. And I would just thank you for having said that, because not only is this something that Catholics can help Orthodox and Protestant Christians with, it also illustrates something I've maintained from the beginning, which is not that I have all the answers in the Benedict option. I hope I'm asking the right questions. And if we Christians are going to make it through this time of dissolution and post-Christianity, we are going to need a real ecumenism in which we can learn from each other without giving up what makes our traditions distinct. I don't think we should all pile it together into one big mushy nothing. That is false ecumenism. But I do believe that we have to learn to get to know each other better and to share the best practices with each other, if you want to use management language, so we can hold on together. Father Newhouse and Chuck Colson said in an earlier generation that Catholics and Protestants came together to know each other and form alliances in front of abortion clinics and an ecumenism of the trenches. I'm calling for maybe a broader, historically informed ecumenism of the trenches with the Benedict option.
Unfortunately, we ran out of time about 15 minutes ago, so we'll have to end. But I encourage you to ask our speakers any questions. But if you wouldn't mind joining me in a round of applause for our panelists.